I just want to call to mind some of the common shortfalls I see in data-driven decision-making in school districts and with city governments that I've consulted with. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself, so that just to give you some reason, or I guess they call it establishing authority. This is why would you want to hear from me on this topic? I am Chief Financial Officer of the 5th largest school district in the state of Oregon. We're probably mid-sized nationally. General fund budget around $150 million a year. And I lead the staff side of the annual budgeting process for this district, of course. I'm also a certified administrator of school finance and operations through ASBO International, and I hold an MBA with a concentration in analytics. Prior to K-12 finance and operations, I got into this field. My mom is the CFO of the school district I grew up in. And so she's been working on me actually ever since high school to get into this business. But I actually started in a corporate career. I worked in corporate supply chain. Most recently, before getting involved in school districts, I was a consultant, and I helped companies determine which capital investments to make, as well as advised on process improvement in their supply chains. That was a really interesting gig. I did renewables investment analyses for oil and gas companies, which surprises a lot of people. But outside of the federal government, oil and gas is investing more money into renewables research than any other industry. And so I worked with oil and gas companies on a future in which they are producing energy without oil and gas. Very fascinating. And prior to that, I was a regional demand planner. I oversaw $3 billion in annual spend. And I've actually found governmental budgeting to be extremely similar to corporate demand planning. So that experience has worked out very well for me. So I want to get us started by just describing my context a little bit. I think you could call me a cynic when it comes to statistics and data, not because I don't believe in them, but because I'm really disheartened with the way that it's being used locally and nationally in a lot of rhetoric. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but this quote is one that a lot of people are familiar with, and it often gets attributed to Mark Twain, but he says that he got it from Benjamin Disraeli, but the phrase doesn't appear in the written record until years after Benjamin Disraeli died, and so some credit Sir Charles Dilke, but that's also conjecture. Elon Musk I just made up and threw on there. I don't think anybody thinks he's the one who said that. But this really highlights the problem. Even with words that can be attributed to people and are in the written record, we can't ever agree on what is fact and what is fiction. Even worse, when we include numbers, it's very easy to use statistics and data to lend credibility to what I believe could easily be called lies. And I think a lot of us have experienced that. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that today. I want to start with rhetorical fallacies. This is a portmanteau of rhetorical and logical. I'll then cover some of the basics involved in analytics, but like I said, I'm gonna skip over some of that with this group just for the sake of time. And then I'll quickly highlight what I have observed both in K-12 and in city government planning that organizations call data-driven decision-making, but the process really isn't. And then I'll go into a process that gets you a little bit closer. I want to be very clear from the outset that the process that I'm going to show you is not meant to be prescriptive. There's a lot of different ways to approach data-driven decision-making. The real crux of this presentation is what isn't data-driven decision-making. And then I will talk about what I call an opportunity for extra credit at the very end. So the first rhetorical fallacies that I want to talk about are burden of proof and unfalsifiability. So burden of proof is when I make a claim and then I tell you that you have to disprove it. And we see this happening a lot in national debates, certainly presidential debates, but this is happening in our communities as well. And so we look at this quote that I put up here. 94% of information on the internet is made up, and I attributed it to Plato. This is obviously something I made up, right? The internet didn't exist when Plato was alive. It's a made up statistic. But if I tell you that you have to prove it, that you have to prove I'm wrong, you can't do that. This isn't what's called an unfalsifiable claim. There's no way that you can disprove that Plato said this. And when we talk about probability, the idea that with billions of people who have ever existed on the earth, it's actually probable that somebody actually has said this before me. Probably not Plato, but somebody has said this probably. And so I've given you an unfalsifiable claim, and I've said that the burden of proof is on you to prove that I'm wrong. You cannot win in this. If you try to debate somebody when they give you an unfalsifiable claim and they put the burden of proof on you, you cannot win that debate. The only way out of this is to flag this as a rhetorical foul and just in the moment call out the fact that this is not a legitimate way to engage in debate and discourse. These types of fallacies are actually made using referenced data pretty often, and they easily lead into two other more pernicious types. And I'm actually going to give you a real example that I've experienced to illustrate this. So the rhetorical fallacy that these two often go into is what's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's a fancy Latin phrase. It just means that one came after the other, so the former must have caused the latter, which we all know is obviously not true. But when I was the CFO of Ashland School District, if you look at this slide, you can see a dot on the far right. That is my current school district, Gresham-Barlow. And what you can't really see is a dot on the far left at 0, because when you look at hard coding of financial data, it looks like Ashland School District does not actually spend money on TAG. So I was in a board meeting, and a parent came in and made this claim using data from our own finances. Said Ashland School District does not spend any money on TAG. And this is why my student won't be able to get into this Ivy League university that they want to get into. And so the burden of proof, then I can't. It's technically unfalsifiable because the data shows that we spend $0 on TAG, and this person did, without even realizing, put the burden of proof onto the school district to say that yes, we do spend money on TAG. And I could go into that. It was a push-in model that Ashland School District used, which means that we couldn't disaggregate the expenditure, but it's actually well known to be more expensive than a pull-out program of TAG where you take the students out of the class and move them to a different area. And so Ashland School District is using one of the most expensive models for both TAG and special ed, but it looked like in financial data that they weren't supporting those students well. And then, of course, the parent made the claim that because we didn't spend money on TAG, it was our fault that their student wouldn't be able to get into an Ivy League university, which I don't know if you all know this or not. No college application asks if you were a TAG student. So it's obviously a false dilemma, but which is another rhetorical fallacy. But be that as it may, Ashland School District spent the next several months defending itself with the state of Oregon and with our community against this erroneous claim that we did not adequately serve TAG students. So then this one is not an actual situation that happened, but this does play out in K-12 very often, and I have seen it at city council and city budget committee meetings. This type of a claim, which affirming the consequent, just means that a claim is being made that there's only one possible explanation for an outcome. And so in this case, the claim is being made that Gresham-Barlow School District cares more about TAG students because of the delta in spending on TAG. As uncomfortable as these can be in a board meeting, this is downright frustrating when you're dealing with your district leadership team or your city leadership team, county leadership team, when you have people who are actually working with you and making these types of claims. So affirming the consequent is something that we always need to have at the front of our mind when we're having discourse about budget decisions, because money is already very emotional. I like to say it's the #1 cause of divorce in America. And so money is something that we all kind of personalize, internalize, and make value judgments about without even realizing it. And so this is just like when we talk about racial justice and racial equity, we need to start from a place of our unconscious biases. It's the same is actually true when we're talking about finance. We have to start from a place of understanding that different people have different biases. I mentioned before, my mom and I are both school district CFOs. The way we manage finances in our district are actually very different, and that's because my mom grew up in poverty, and she and my dad had some economic mobility. By the time I was in my kind of formative years, they were no longer in poverty, and I grew up in a pretty comfortable middle class life. And so my view of the scarcity of resources is vastly different than my mom's. These are things we come to the table with without even realizing. So I've noticed that decision support software is getting a lot of attention right now. In K-12, there's a tool called Forecast 5 that allows people to benchmark against other school districts and things like that. And these decision support software tools are being used by your local media. They're being used by regional media, national media. They're being used by your communities, especially if you're using something like OpenGov and you're putting that forward facing to your community, which I fully support. But going back to what I talked about earlier, it is very easy to make claims using data that aren't actually true. And this is where the term fake news comes from, and it's become so prevalent. And it can cause us to be at odds with our stakeholders, but we should not be quick to dismiss the claim of fake news. As demonstrated with those previous slides, it's very easy to draw erroneous conclusions, even when reliable data are used. So I've grown fond of saying at times, I agree with your facts, but not your conclusions. And sometimes that's a way to reframe the conversation a little bit so that we can get a little bit deeper into what data is, what the data are actually showing us. So really what it boils down to, the question is the user of the tool just a user, or are they an analyst? And if they are not an analyst, then it's incumbent upon us as the public officials who claim to be the experts in this to provide a guided analysis of the data. It's not enough to just turn the data forward facing to our communities in an effort to call it transparency. We have to provide analysis and reliable analysis of the data. So to kind of illustrate that a little further, we need to understand what data are or is, singular and plural of data, same word. And so I've provided a couple of definitions here that I just quickly Googled. But what I really want to highlight here is that we often hear people say the data show and then XYZ. They say this is what the data show, which is not an accurate statement. An analysis of the data may show XYZ, but the data themselves only show a set of conditions that relate to a set of variables. So analysis is always required. And so when somebody comes to you and says the data show XYZ, we have to be prepared to have a conversation about the fact that that is that person's analysis of the data they're looking at. And the common process used in data-driven decision-making in organizations, public and private, which I will show a little bit later, leads to erroneous analysis pretty commonly. It's very susceptible to it. So we have some steps that we have to take to employ data analysis in our decision making. So this is the part that I'm going to skip a little bit. I've provided a couple of examples of the difference between referencing data and analyzing data. The former happens a lot in data-driven decision-making conversations. The latter is what needs to happen. And so then from here, the next few slides are just about how to engage in the analytic process. And this is the part that I don't really want to spend too much time on, because I'm pretty sure this audience, maybe this is a review of information. But I will make these slides available to Jake so that you can go through these, and if you feel inclined, use them with your organization. I like to do this every year at the start of a budgeting process, just because there's so much turnover in school districts and with our boards. So every year when I start the budgeting process, these are things that I cover with our stakeholders that are closest to the budgeting process, so that we can get through the budgeting process with a little bit more efficacy. So we have quantitative and qualitative types, of course. And so now getting into, this is what I see as a very common process when I'm working in my own school district, but also when I'm consulting with municipal governments and county governments and things like that. So the question gets asked, why are we experiencing symptom X? And then we form a hypothesis, which is great. That's fine. That is a valid next step in a process. The problem is when we get to this step 3 and we find data to support the hypothesis, and then we make the claim that the data supports what we think is causing this symptom. And so an example that I like to use, and I'll omit the school district's names for their sake. There was a school district a few years back here in Oregon that implemented a third grade literacy program. And the intent behind this was to make sure that that third graders, all third graders in their district, were literate at third grade standard by the time they left third grade. And the I guess you could say the hypothesis that they had was that if they were able to do that, then that would improve graduation rates down the road. Because that's a well-studied dynamic, is that when students are not at grade level by the end of third grade, it starts kind of this domino, this ripple effect that follows the student all the way through 12th grade, and it can impact graduation rates. Over the next 3 years after implementing this program, graduation rates did improve in that school district, and then the school district presented on this at a school board association conference. And they made the claim that their investment in this third grade literacy program was the cause of the improved graduation rates that they were experiencing. And I think that all of us on this call would probably immediately call foul on that. How is investing in third grade literacy now? Your first cohort just got to third grade. How did that improve your graduation rates? And so you dig into it a little bit more, and I think probably a more a reliable explanation would be the fact that during that time, that school district experienced a significant amount of gentrification. And so they went from being a high poverty school district to a low poverty school district seemingly overnight. When you look at those same 3 years where their graduation rates improved, all of the school districts around them had declining graduation rates. And I think that's probably a more reliable explanation, but even that is still conjecture, because we didn't establish a study to look at what was impacting the graduation rates. We were just looking at data and formed a false correlation. And so this is what happens when we use the process that I just showed you. And this actually is real data. Again, I'm using my former school district and my current school district. I'll tell you right up at front, Ashland School District has a much higher performance level than Gresham Barlow School District does for its students. And so that's what figure 1 shows us, is that, and I rolled it up, but even when you disaggregate this by grade, by ethnicity, you can break this down any way you want. This distribution pretty much holds. And so then on the next thing, I'm showing you the amount that Gresham Barlow spends on teachers, administrators, and licensed subs. Gresham Barlow spends more in those 3 categories, whereas Ashland spends more on classified staff and classified substitute teachers. Classified in K-12 refers to support services like food service, transportation, and maintenance, things like that. And so the clear takeaway, if you're using that process that I just showed you, is that spending more on support services and less on instruction leads to better student outcomes, right? That's probably not the case. I can't say with any authority that that's not the case, but I think that studies into what improves student achievement show that spending money in the classroom is what helps, and spending money on specialists to support students who need a little bit of extra help is what helps students achieve better. And so again, Ashland, very affluent community in Southern Oregon. The board when I was there was filled with retirees who had all retired before the age of 40. So these are parents who are completely involved in their kids' education and have resources like most Americans don't. And then Gresham Barlow, also Ashland, very homogenous, almost completely white. And then Gresham Barlow has a lot more socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, worldview diversity. I mean, the diversity in Gresham Barlow is very significant, but it's a much higher poverty school district, and so there's probably some other explanations that we could look to, but I think we can all agree that this takeaway probably not accurate. And so we don't want to make decisions this way, right? We don't want to go into a budgeting process and say, let's lay off 30% of our teachers so that we can hire more custodians and food service workers, because that is what will help our students do better. That's clearly not any way to make decisions, but it's a very common way of making decisions in governmental budgeting. Okay, so an example of a better process would be same first two steps: identify the data needs, and then ask questions, form a hypothesis, and then identify what information do we need to solve the problem, to look at to prove or disprove the hypothesis. And then you're going to harvest data. You're going to make a decision about what data you will use, how it must be shaped to provide some insights. You're going to establish some KPIs, key performance indicators, to know if we're moving toward our goals or not. We're going to eliminate useless data. One of the problems that we have in the era of big data is just pushing all kinds of data out to people, and this actually can obscure the truth sometimes. And so an illustration, I like to use mixed metaphors. If you're going to go on a snorkeling trip and you get to do one snorkeling trip in your whole life, are you going to go off the coast of Oregon, or off the coast of Maine, or are you going to go off the coast of Hawaii? And why? Well, right along the west coast and the east coast of the mainland United States, the water is extremely dirty. You can't see anything. It's filled. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that you're going to see, but you're not going to see the bottom. You're not going to see the fish. You're not going to see the coral reefs, anything like that. Hawaii, you're going to see all of those things. And so transparency isn't actually an abundance of data. Transparency is data that's usable by the person that you're giving it to. So we're going to eliminate useless data. We're going to conduct a statistical analysis. Again, I'm not going to go into that because I think this group probably is aware of that. And then you're going to store, manage, and access data for the future. Then you might, at that point, integrate technology. This is the point where you would use a decision support software, and then you're going to answer your questions. But what the primary difference between this and the more common process is, with this, you're identifying what you want to look at, and then you're forming a way of isolating that variable and looking at it over time going into the future. Whereas in that more common process, you're taking a look back at data that was never intended to answer the question in front of you. And so you should not be using that data to try to answer the question in front of you. It was not meant to answer that question. So we want to answer questions with data that was intended to answer these questions. And then finally, here's where the bonus points come in. This is the point in the process where you are visualizing data, presenting it to your community in a way that they can access it, understand it, and use it to help inform what they want of their public agency so that we can better serve our communities.